and welcome to Corporate Culture, your podcast about cooperation, conflict, and culture at work. Today, we speak with Fabian Grauel. Fabian is an experienced Agile coach and innovation consultant. And with him, we would like to talk about how teams and organizations can improve cooperation and innovation at the workplace. Fabian, thank you very much for joining today.
Thank you, Paul, for having me. I'm very happy to be here and join your talk.
Great. Maybe to start with, Fabian, you had a lot of different professional roles so far in this whole huge field of agility, of innovation. I saw, for example, that you worked as a junior product owner at Deutsche Bank. You worked also in coaching and service design at PricewaterhouseCoopers. And the last years, you were an agile coach and innovation consultant at a company called launchlabs. Maybe you can tell us a bit about these different roles. For those who are not so familiar with these terms, how was this career journey for you and what were these professional roles that I just mentioned?
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. And maybe to point out the one thing that they have in common, because Deutsche Bank is known, PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers is probably known, but launchlabs is probably one of the companies you never heard of. But all of these companies have one thing in common, and that is that they cared about innovation in some part of their company. And that's actually where I, as a master student in entrepreneurship, also always try to focus on the innovation part of the company. So in Deutsche Bank, that was actually a software development part, the digital factory, where we developed new gateways, new APIs. And that was in a Scrum setup. So for those of the listeners who maybe don't know Scrum, a methodology from the Agile world that's used or that's coming from software development and is used for complex problems, for rapid development, for quick changes and iterative work. And junior product owner was something like a little project manager. Maybe you could envision it something like that. Mm-hmm. The role is a bit different in Agile because this project manager isn't the controlling manager. So in Agile, we don't have this control, command and control thinking, but we rather have a pull mentality. So people take on responsibility by themselves, which means that the product owner is rather someone sharing a vision of a project or of a product and guiding a team. Mm-hmm. And from this agile environment where it was about software development and working in a small Scrum team with 5-6 members, me as the product owner, I moved on to the next stage for me to look at innovation at a larger scale and say, how does innovation generally come up in a company? And that was for me a question that I tried to answer at PwC in the field of service design, which is concerned precisely with the question, how can we, from user observations and from the understanding of humans, derive new innovations and ideas that we can bring to the market and that are accepted and then also loved by users. So here we have this talking that maybe you know from Apple, from other fancy companies, where it's about creating fans, creating love, emotion, which is also part of the Agile world, but not written in the Agile manifesto or anything. It just comes along with it a little bit. And that's also part of what I like very much, this enthusiasm. And now coming to the last stage where I was Agile coach. So neither was I the project manager, nor was I the one designing services on deriving innovation, but I was one consulting companies, both on internal structures as an Agile coach. So on internal structures on how to come up with innovation in a cross-functional team environment. And on the other side, to really conduct these design sprints, as we call it in the design thinking methodology, in the human-centered approach. So design projects as a consultant, as a coach, and facilitate them to bring this new work, new style of working also into larger organizations and corporations, mainly in Germany, but also worldwide.
Wow. Sounds super interesting. And I really want to dive a bit deeper into these different approaches. But before we do that, what I realized is that you had different perspective on this innovation issue. You said that you worked as a coach, as a facilitator, as a consultant, and I feel that exactly these three roles are a bit different. So they're different approaches to support people who are trying to become innovative or to enhance innovation. Maybe you can explain a bit the difference between being a coach being a facilitator and being a consultant?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I like that you differentiate between these three roles. At my previous company, we actually even had two more roles, so I'm
Okay.
trying to not to get confused about them right now. But for me, I think the coach is one essential role that you touched upon, and it's one role that's maybe new because people know coaches as, I don't know, sport coaches, right? So people who are trainers as well, who tell how to do something. But that's not what I understand as a coach in the business context, right? So in the business context, I would rather assume that a coach is something like a systemic coach who tries to help a client by showing new ways, asking the right questions, and opening up new ways of thinking in the end. So a coach is rather someone who helps you find the solution yourself.
Right.
And that's maybe also the sharp barrier between a coach and a consultant, because a consultant is someone who's telling you his or her best way to their best knowledge of how to do something. So a consultant is usually paid for coming in, giving advice, setting up a new structure, and then that is accepted and lived through as well as possible. But that's not what a coach would do. A coach would never come with their own structure and idea, but rather get it from you. And those two roles are both, I think, a big part of working in the agile scenario, but not only in the agile scenario, also in traditional ways of working, right? So also traditional ways of working know that there's a big part in choosing the right setup, knowing the best way how to do it, giving this advice like the consultant would do. But also there's a big value in empowering people, really helping them develop the solution themselves to also make it sustainable in a way, right? Sustainability not in the ecological sense, but in the durability sense.
The span that I often see is the one with the two extremes where you have the process on the one side and the content on the other side, right? And the way I understand you is to say the consulting part is basically more focused on content and also suggesting content, whereas coaching and facilitation, I would say as well, is more on the process side, where you don't really give recommendation on the content, but more look on the process of things, right?
Yes, I totally agree with you. And facilitation, maybe the last thing that I didn't talk about so much right now. Facilitation is also like coaching about holding a space. But whereas coaching is more holding the mental space for people to uncover new ways of thinking, facilitation is more about holding the physical space or the digital space or whatever it is nowadays, right? So it's about which methods do we choose for maybe workshop participants to exchange, to communicate. Is it a front thing, or are people talking to each other? Are we maybe even working with different groups on different topics and developing stuff ourselves? So here the facilitator is like the room holder, placeholder for the physical and physical and digital space, and setting up the structure for people to be empowered and really develop themselves, as the coach is in the mental space. So I would go with your distinguishing between content and structure, definitely.
And we started the discussion with this big focus on innovation. And when I talk about innovation with people, what comes up very quickly is the keyword agility, being agile in the workplace. I would be interested to know what agility means to you, and why do you think that it is an important part of today's working world?
Yeah, I'm asking myself that also a lot of times, and I think in some areas it's definitely very valuable to think about agility, and in some areas it's maybe not so valuable to think about agility. But let's come to that in a second. Maybe before we go into that, one thing that just came to my mind is when we talk about innovation, what do we mean by that, right? Because innovation also is a very broad term, and I think innovation can mean really bringing something entirely new to life. That is like the most extreme version of it. So something that's never been there before. But maybe for the context of this podcast, that's probably not the innovation we're talking about right now. But it's more about also recombination of things, right? Or putting existing ideas into a different context. By that, creating an innovation in a sector or in a different area, but not like the raw innovation that we're talking about by creating something entirely new. Not sure if that's even possible, but that's a different podcast topic. And now let's maybe go into that agile question that you asked, because I think that wherever we have to do with innovation, we are mostly uncovering new areas, right? So mostly maybe we're taking something from somewhere else, we're recombining it with something we already have, and we're creating something that now comes to life. So for us, it's an innovation that we bring to life here. And that means that we're navigating through unknown waters, and there is maybe risk involved, maybe a lack of information, and we have to make very little steps and always have a good look around to have an impression of where we are and what steps are necessary to move forward on our journey. And that is what we as coaches, consultants would call a complex environment, right? That is where we don't know yet a best practice solution, but we have to work iteratively. And that's a big foundational pillar, from my perspective, to the agile work, right? So what does it take for people to actually take on responsibility, make decisions on the go, and really be flexible in their thinking so that an organization can, in an agile way, ideally adapt very quickly to changing environments, to this complex environment, and find the best suitable way to develop an innovation. But yeah, that's maybe one answer.
Yeah, and it's true that most companies, organizations, teams face really complex challenges and issues, as you said. And I have the feeling that many of them are in search of some kind of innovative new approach, whatever it is. Maybe it's not the new iPhone, as you said, but maybe something on a smaller scale, but some sort of search for innovation. And I found it interesting that you said that agility is not always the solution, because it's also an impression that I have that now everybody's trying to implement agility no matter what. But that would lead me to my next question. What do you think are the most important prerequisites for innovation? Like, which paths do you think are the most promising when a team or an organization is searching for innovation, for new ways of doing things?
I think there are, from a scientific point of view, a couple of things that have been elaborated. Let me just dive into some of them, which I think are most relevant from my point of view from work. And definitely one of them is having the right people on board. So whether you call it inclusion, diversity, cross-functional teamwork, breaking down silos, no matter how you call it, it's about mixing things up. So basically what I want to say is we don't want to have only white people in the room. No shame here. But we want to have a mixed up team with different views of the world that can also really elaborate this complex environment from different perspectives. Because if people are too homogeneous and we have this environment that is constantly changing, we are always moving in some direction, but we lack perspectives, right? We can never say if this is a good direction. So the more information we're lacking, the more diverse we need our team to be to solve the problem, right? So that's when it comes to complexity, solving this complexity of unknowns to create an innovation. And the second thing that we really have to deal with is the structure of the project. So management buy-in is, I think, the essential, right? To have the resources allocated and the freedom for people also time-wise to participate in such projects or take part in innovation topics. And that is in reality, in practice, one of the greatest hindrances is that people have their daily business, right? So one comes up with the idea to have innovative projects in the company, one sets up the framework and gives money, there is management buy-in, people are on board, we have a diverse team, and then the people who are doing this are often bound and stuck in their daily work and have no time to cope with the extra work as it's perceived. And that's, I think, the mental model, maybe my third point, that's behind that. So why is innovation? What do we need as a prerequisite for innovation? We need a mental model that helps us to fail and learn, right? So we need a mental model that is based on not being perfect, but trying things out, learning individually and as a group. And that is, from my point of view, our experience a bit opposed to what we had the last 100 years, where it was more about someone having the master plan that needs to be followed in order to achieve a goal, right? So that's from my point of view, the three topics that I would emphasize most.
Yeah, makes real sense. And especially the third point that you mentioned, this this awareness and also this allowance for failure and for trying things out reminds me a lot of the games approach that I also use a lot in facilitation to use games for, of course, serious problems. But that would also be an interesting question for me. So assuming that the first 2 points are all right, you have the right people, they have the time, they have the mental capacities, there's no other work to do, they have a whole weekend, no matter where in the mountains, alone without smartphones. And now I think it's about, okay, which methods are the best to actually come up with new things, with new ideas. And I think that games is a really interesting approach, playing. And I'm curious what you think about that, about games, play, and innovation.
Yeah, I think it was also one of the points that triggered you most when we got to know each other,
Yeah.
talking about games and which games to play in which setup. So beautiful question, definitely, because you as well as we are both concerned with breaking up structures of communication, enabling communication, enabling people to step out of their comfort zone, but B, also step out of their mental model that they're in right now, right? So maybe be someone else that they are in their company. And that is something that the ones of you who have participated in retros, in agile methodologies, maybe you know that from agile, that it feels a bit different. If you're doing things with post-its, if you're maybe playing Scrum planning poker with playing cards, you're estimating t-shirt sizes, I don't know. So it's a different approach that's meant to get us from where we are stuck in our daily routines, transcend our awareness a little bit, and allow us to behave in a different way than we maybe would regularly, or communicate in a different way. And specifically, games are a huge beneficial point here for communication for the people in your mountain resort, Paul. Because games would actually allow some of these people who maybe are grumpy, maybe don't really care about what's going on, maybe don't really care about the topic at all, to transcend beyond that and in a fun setting, playing always, no risk involved, just be yourself, just participate in a fun setting, experience maybe a different situation, maybe a different mindset, and take something as a learning from that. And that's probably also one important point I would like to stress here, is that it's not only about playing, but also about the reflection afterwards. So for me as a coach and facilitator, a game can never take place without at least 30 minutes of reflection time afterwards, where we talk through what has happened right now in the game, what were the mechanics, and what we take from that for everyday life. And maybe last thought I have to that. Interestingly, what we're doing here is the same thing that people are also doing in art coaching, for example, where art is used to transcend your awareness, right? To leave out the spoken word and say, oh, I feel like this picture. And by using the picture as a metaphor, you are able to communicate things differently, see things more clearly. And in a way, we're doing that as agile coaches also with this gamification approach that we have. So by making things playful, we break up the existing social structures. People get together. We always have the team building aspect, but that's not the main point. The main point is actually the reflection and learning aspect afterwards. And we've done a couple of cool things there. So in my last company, we actually have plenty of examples where we develop games and used games in budgeting, allocation meetings, used game in team, constellations to set up roles and set up teams. We used games to introduce the agile way of working. We used games to introduce pieces of Scrum. I think some of those methods are familiar to you too, right?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of these things is done using games. And 2 weeks ago, I took part in a workshop that was 3 days long and had no games in it. And it was incredibly tough. I cannot remember like working without games, having it without this agile way and participation way. And now 2 weeks ago, I felt what it's like to have a teacher talking to you 3 days in a row. And yeah, I was reminded of what I'm doing and why it's important.
Yeah, and I really like your example about the art coaching, for example, because for me it's one of these methods or approaches to break mental habits or mental patterns, right? I also made the experience, even with myself, that when you said yourself something 5 times already and you get the question about that topic again, you will say almost automatically the same answer again, just because you said it a lot of times. And bringing people out of speaking by art, for example, or through other forms of communication or games, I think it's really powerful.
Yeah, and we know this, funnily, we know this from our grandmother, who is always repeating the same stories over and over again. And we
Yeah,
all assume to be different, you know, because we're
yeah,
young and we're not that old yet, but in a way, we're the same human being. We're going to be like that probably. And the
yeah.
first patterns are already showing where we reinforce our mental models again and again and again.
It's
And,
true.
you know, that's thinking out of the box, leaving your comfort zone. It's all these fluffy explanations. And part of these sentences is always breaking your mental model for a second and jumping out of it, right? To
Yeah,
see things from a different perspective. And
yeah,
I think design thinking, you know, what I'm doing with design sprints and everything, same story. There it's about users, humans, and empathy. So again, it's about breaking up your own mental model, your own perspective of the world, and instead incorporating the one of a user, see it user-centric and develop it from their way. So
yeah,
super interesting what you're saying there, right? Breaking up mental models seems to be the baseline of almost all coaching and yeah, consulting.
yeah, yeah. And you just mentioned design thinking. Um, I know it's not that easy, but can you maybe give a definition in one sentence for people who don't know what it is? So like, what is design thinking as a method?
Yeah, definitely. I think for most people know it by now. It's some weeks ago, someone at an official public thing in Germany asked me if I was doing design thinking with official I. So I saw, okay, it's not only in corporates, it's everywhere. Design thinking is all around. And maybe to make it short, design thinking consists of a few steps. They always have various different names. And it is an iterative approach, means that the steps which you have in a sequence are repeated over and over and over again, right? So it's always like a loop doing the same steps again and again. And these steps move through what we call double diamonds. So phases of divergence, where we open up our thinking for new perspectives, for user insights, for whatever. And phases of convergence. So phases where we narrow down, we focus, we point something out. We always do that as a team. We have a team size of 5 to 8 people, like it's usual for highly performing teams. And in design thinking, these steps are from a team understanding to user understanding and prototyping. So what we usually start with is that we start with what we see as a team, what we have in internal resources, what we bring to the table. And then we go into a second phase and we focus on the user. So above our own opinions, we would now rather see the user's opinions and design prototypes and solutions for the user in order to do something beneficial for their desires, help them do something that they want to achieve. Whether it's a service or a product, that doesn't really matter. And once we've done that, we've created this prototype, the solution, we show it to the user, we give it to the user. So maybe from a different methodology, minimum viable product is a terminology that someone knows. So we create something small, a prototype, an MVP, something that the user can test. And based on the feedback of the user, we are going into the second iteration. Again, we do the team understanding. We see, do we all have the same understanding of this feedback? What do we think could be changed? We go into the user research again, we prototype and iterate over and over.
Right, right. And I like the separation you made between team understanding and user understanding, because I use design thinking a lot as well. And recently I started using design thinking for team development processes. So the team members are also the users. And it worked quite well. There are some adaptations that you have to make. But what the question behind for me is, what design thinking is particularly suitable for, and what are things where you would say design thinking is not really a good approach generally?
It's very similar to what I've said before to Agile. Design thinking is a very useful approach when you think about the design, right? That's your thinking about the design. That's why it's called design thinking. About the design of something that's new, of something that you've not done before, of something where you're exploring unknowns. And design thinking by its nature, with this user research and people-centeredness, and we're always trying to get feedback and to iterate, it's not suitable if you already know the answer, right? So if you have a project and you say, let's say I want to sit and I want a chair and I know pretty much that I want a chair and you know what it looks like, then it's more feasible to follow a linear approach and produce that chair to get it done, than to go into exploration mode and ask people about the purpose of sitting and what's your desire behind sitting? Why do you do that? What do you want to achieve? So I'm not saying you cannot design chairs with design thinking, because you can, but not if you already know which kind of chair you're producing. So if you already know the result and there's no way that this result is going to change throughout the process, then go for waterfall, classic project management, try to set it up with, freedom for the employees so that they can actually have some decision freedom. But don't go for design thinking. Design thinking is for setting up something new, something in interdisciplinary teams, something where you have complexity. And I like your example really much, because one, it shows how important it is to differentiate between users and people in the project, right? So you get to some point where maybe you have interests conflicting because you're also part of the project group and you're part of the user group. So that's a very, very interesting point, delicate point when you're a facilitator. And design thinking is definitely this team building aspect, but it also needs to have something to do with the users in the end.
Makes sense. I know that you talked a lot in recent weeks and months about a new approach that you are following at the moment, which includes or which focuses on sustainability. And I found it super interesting because I see that especially in sustainability, there are so many complex challenges, and almost everyone, no matter where he or she works, faces this topic of sustainability in some way, I think. And I would love, as the last part of our discussion, to talk about this connection between what we had before, agility, innovation, and sustainability. And to start with, I would like to ask you first, if you can define sustainability. What does sustainability mean for you in the workplace environment?
Yeah, good question. Generally speaking, for me, sustainability is part of social sustainability is part of sustainability, and ecological sustainability is part of sustainability. That's, from my idealistic view, the two big parts of this sustainability. But when it comes to doing sustainable business, there's a third pillar that's very important, and that's sustainable business, right? So financial viability, economical viability, and having that long term. And these three pillars are definitely what I see as sustainability in the organizational context, right? So social, meaning inclusion, meaning fair pay, meaning work-life balance, meaning whatever, right, we need right now. That's the social component. The ecological component, which is more easy to understand, which has a lot to do with climate change and avoiding climate gases and avoiding plastics and reducing pollution in the end. And the economical perspective is the one we know. right? That's the one we're having so far. That's having financially stable companies that make profit, that cover the costs, and that can exist for a longer period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it reminds me a bit of what you said before about this distinction between linear approaches. So you know where you want to go or you have to go. And the others, iterative approaches like design thinking, where you say, I'm open about what is going to happen, where to go, and I'm searching for innovation. And especially in the field of sustainability, I find it interesting because if you believe in the science in a lot of aspects, climate change, wherever, the goal is actually quite clear, I would say. But still, you argue that agility innovation is still an important factor in this whole debate. Maybe you can elaborate a bit, like what role does agility and innovation play in this context of sustainability?
Yeah. Because it is a complex environment, as you pointed out, I think the agility comes into play. And to elaborate on that, to maybe make that clear a bit more, I would like to quickly introduce the donut economics model that for me is a key model to understanding sustainable behavior and economical behavior, right? So not only biological sustainability, but really the doing business sustainably aspect. And the donut model holds basically two things. So at the core, we have the social prerequisites, so to say, the social needs, social desires that we have as humans. So safety, food, nutrition, equality, justice, fundamental values that we as societies need to exist and that we need to take care of, because otherwise societies break down, as we've seen it in history. So there's like a minimum need that we need to fulfill for societies to exist peacefully and to work together for humans. And then on the other side, there's something like the outer shell. And this outer shell is known, right? That's what you've been talking about. That's science-based evidence that we have right now. So of course, people can argue that science has changed over 100 years. 100 years ago, we didn't know psychological analysis, right? So things change and viewpoints change, but to the best of our knowledge right now, we have this hard evidence, as you pointed out, that tells us where to go, right? We have limits that we have in various areas, whether it's in the acidification of sea, whether it's CO2 emissions in the air, methane, other gases. So there's a couple of these things, a couple of these tipping points that we know from sustainability science that we are heading towards. And there's a sweet spot in between, right? There's a spot where we fulfill basic needs as a society, and maybe even more than basic needs. So maybe we even have a decent life, and still we don't hit this environmental ceiling that we are constantly running against right now, right? Where we constantly see lack of resources here, prices are rising, we need new fields for oil exploration, blah, blah, blah. So everywhere we're hitting this shell right now, and we're seeing everything is melting and climate is changing. And because we have to navigate this space, right? This is complex. It's a complex space because it's made up of human behavior. And I think that's what makes it interesting, because theoretically speaking, we know we could follow a linear path that would lead us to a zero emission, and then we would be done with it. But practically, we see the same thing that we also see in organizations, that people don't automatically follow this linear planned structure, but they behave human. So going from a human-centered perspective and also incorporating this teamwork aspect and cooperation, and I really love the fit here with the corporate culture. But this is essential for solving sustainability problems, because it's not about the technology to solve them. It's not about where we need to go. We all know that. It's actually about us, right? We know how hard it is to incorporate sustainability in our everyday lives, and it feels bad. So it doesn't feel like fun. It's a restriction, it's a limitation, it's a reduction. We have a lot of bad words that we use for that. And that's a classical context for me to use gamification, to use all of these methods that we talked about, break up mental models and say, hey, sustainable innovation can be quite cool. Sustainable innovation is actually fun. It's enriching. You can take responsibility to develop something new that's not only ego-centered and human-centered anymore, it's planet-centered. So we include humans, of course, we're part of this planet, but we're not the only ones. So moving a step further, I think would be very interesting. And doing that, maybe games can help us to also break the mental models, break the structures, and feel that it could also be fun.
Yeah. I really love your ideas. And to be honest, it was one of the reasons I wanted to invite you to the podcast today. We discussed that. And you also told me that you have some specific projects at the moment that are trying to link all the expertise in the agility world, in the innovation world, with the sustainability issues that you just mentioned. And maybe to conclude, could you maybe tell us a bit about some specific projects that you have in this area that you maybe work on at the moment?
Yeah, definitely. I'd like to. So maybe before I do an advertising block right here, this is not about advertising. It's more about the agile thinking that we had throughout this whole podcast. And we've just touched upon it very quickly, but making prototypes, creating something, getting it out to the public, getting feedback, which is an essential part to the incremental way of agile working in a sense. Is also what I'm doing right now. And therefore, if you're interested, always feel free to contact me and give me feedback. I need that for further development. But two really cool things I'm working on right now that I would also like to share here with the community is, first of all, leveraging design thinking methodologies. So this diverging, converging that I've talked about, which is in a way comparable to also agile methodologies and gamification, right? Using a team-based approach, but leveraging it beyond human-centered. And I've created a huge set of methods that is actually useful for moving things from human-centered to planet-centered.
Wow.
So wherever design thinking is always about empathy, feeling a user, I believe that's something we can also do with the world. And I'm not the only one, so there's many outdoor coaches, nature coaches, whatever. But there's a lot of beautiful methodologies on how to leverage that empathy also for the planet.
Wow.
So that's something I'm working on. Not only me, but a lot of people out there. So there's a lot standing on the shoulders of giants, right? There's a lot of things out there that you can recycle also here. And maybe let me say that quickly before we end this. Also, Scrum and everything else is recycled. They didn't invent it. But the second thing I would really like also to mention, and thank you for giving me the floor here, is also I'm trying right now to use this gamification approach to really break up the mental models that we have concerning sustainability. Because so far it always feels like a pain and it always feels like we have to do this and we don't want to. So right now I'm working on a board game, literal with paper and pen and everything board game that you can play together with a group in order to also afterwards reflect. And really uncover why maybe it's also fun to do something sustainable. So imagine Monopoly, but not a capitalist game, but rather we have a beautiful company and beautiful environment game. And I think that could be also a good opener for workshops, for trainings, for anything, but maybe also just a game that's fun to play. So let's see how it's developing in the future.
Nice. Awesome. Sounds like really cool projects. I will definitely follow you and your work, and I recommend everyone listening to do the same. Fabian, thank you very much for your time. It was incredibly interesting. I got a lot of inspiration. I hope our listeners got some interesting insights as well. And I wish you all the best for your future projects.
Thank you so much for having me, Paul. For you as well.